The wooden slats of the walkway were damp, steaming slightly in the crisp November morning air of Camp Lee, Virginia, 1945. Helga stood frozen at the threshold of the newly constructed pine building, her knuckles white as she gripped the arm of Ingrid, a younger nurse who was trembling violently. The air here did not smell of unwashed bodies, dysentery, or wet wool scents that had clung to their skin like a second uniform for half a year. Instead, it smelled impossibly sharp and sweet, citrus and steam. A tall American sergeant, Miller, stood by the entrance. He wore his service cap tilted slightly back, holding a clipboard. There were no guards with rifles pointed at their backs, only a pile of clean, white towels folded with military precision on a table. Helga stepped in front of Ingrid, her chin lifted, bracing for the humiliation she had been warned about the public hosing down, the jeers. "Room 3 is open, ma'am," Sergeant Miller said, his voice low, lacking any edge of command. He extended a hand. Not to grab her, but to offer a small, rectangular bar wrapped in paper. "There is a latch on the inside. No one comes in unless you call for a medic." Helga stared at the object. Ivory soap. She looked at the wooden door, solid and opaque. "Go on," Miller added, shifting his weight respectfully. "Take your time. The water is hot." Please subscribe and comment below with a story of reconciliation from your country's history. 6 months earlier, the Ruhr Pocket, Germany, April 1945. The Ruhr Pocket, Germany. The ceiling of the field hospital, a repurposed cellar beneath a shattered textile factory, shuddered violently. A fine mist of pulverized brick and plaster rained down, coating everything in a ghostly gray powder. It settled on the bandages, on the instruments, and on the eyelashes of the 24 women huddled in the corner. Helga Müller, Oberin, head nurse, swiped a finger across the instrument tray. It came away gray. She tasted the grit between her teeth. It tasted like defeat. "Water, Oberin?" Ingrid whispered. The young nurse was clutching a metal canteen, turning it upside down. Not a drop fell. "The pipes were hit in the last barrage," Helga said, her voice raspy. She checked her own thirst, pushing it into a small, locked box in the back of her mind. "Pack the kits. We move in 5 minutes." "Move where?" Clara asked, her voice sharp with panic. "The Americans are half a kilometer away. I heard the tanks." "Away from the impact zone," Helga snapped. "Upstairs, into the courtyard." She led them up the crumbling stone stairs. The daylight was blinding, filtered through a haze of smoke that smelled of burning rubber and cordite. The courtyard was a ruin. A shell crater in the center had torn open the earth, exposing the wet, clay soil beneath the cobblestones. Helga looked at her nurses. Their uniforms were stained with the blood of the patients they had left behind, but they were still women. Young, terrified women. She knew the stories. She knew what happened when discipline broke down and conquering armies advanced. A clean, pretty nurse was a target. Helga walked to the edge of the crater. The ground was churned up, a mixture of mud and stagnant rainwater. She knelt down. "Oberin?" Ingrid asked, horrified. Helga plunged her hands into the cold, dark muck. She dug her fingers in, feeling the slime coat her skin, burying the white cleanliness that defined her profession. She stood up, her hands dripping black sludge. "Come here," Helga ordered Ingrid. "But..." "Come here." Helga grabbed the girl's collar. With a brutal efficiency, she smeared the mud across Ingrid's cheeks, her forehead, and down the front of her starched tunic. Ingrid gasped, tears welling up, but she stood still. "Listen to me." Helga addressed the group, her voice low and fierce. "You are not nurses anymore. You are not women. You are refuse. You are part of the rubble. If you want to survive the next 24 hours without being touched, you will make yourselves repulsive. One by one, The women stepped forward. The ritual was silent and grim. They destroyed their own image, plastering their hair with grease from a destroyed truck, rubbing dirt into their necks. Helga was the last. She covered her face until she felt like a gargoyle. A mechanical roar drowned out the wind. The stone archway of the courtyard exploded inward. An American Sherman tank crushed the debris, its long barrel swinging toward them. Behind it, infantrymen in olive drab poured in, rifles raised. Hands up, Hände hoch. Helga raised her muddy hands. She felt the crust beginning to dry on her skin, tightening like a mask. The Americans looked at them, a group of filthy, unrecognizable creatures rising from the earth. The soldiers lowered their rifles slightly, wrinkled their noses in disgust, and waved them toward the holding area. They were alive, but the bath was over. The long season of filth had begun. May 1945, aboard a Liberty ship, North Atlantic. Time ceased to exist in the hold. There was no day or night, only the rhythmic, nauseating heave of the ship's hull and the relentless vibration of the propeller shaft beneath the steel deck. The air was a tangible thing, a sour soup of diesel fumes, vomit, and the fermentation of hundreds of unwashed bodies packed into the cargo bay. Helga sat with her back against a rusted bulkhead, her legs pulled tight against her chest to avoid the boots of the woman sleeping opposite her. The armor of mud she had applied in the Ruhr had long since cracked and flaked away, replaced by a darker, oilier layer of ship grime. Her skin felt tight, itching constantly. Oberon. Ingrid moaned. Her head was resting on Helga's lap. The girl's skin was burning. Her lips were cracked, bleeding slightly where the salt air had dried them out. Shh, Helga whispered, brushing a strand of greasy hair from Ingrid's forehead. We are moving. Every turn of the screw brings us closer to land. Water, Ingrid rasped. Helga checked their canteen. Empty. The rations were distributed once a day, barely enough to keep kidneys functioning, certainly not enough for hygiene or fever. Helga looked up toward the hatch, 30 feet above, where a square of gray light marked the only exit. A young American MP sat on the metal grating, swinging his legs. He was eating an apple, slicing it with a pocket knife. Next to him sat a bucket of water for the guards to dip their ladles. Helga shifted Ingrid's weight gently and stood up. Her joints popped. She made her way through the maze of sleeping prisoners, climbing the iron ladder toward the light. The metal rungs were slick with condensation. When her head cleared the hatch level, the guard looked down. He didn't point his rifle, but his expression was one of guarded disgust. He looked at her matted hair, the dark smudges on her neck. Water, Helga said, holding out the empty canteen. Ration time is 1,800, the guard said, not looking up from his apple. Get back down. My friend, Helga said, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her throat. The guard hesitated, looking at the bucket, then back at her. Against regs. Lady. Helga reached into the hidden pocket of her tunic, her fingers closed around cold metal. It was her father's watch, a silver timepiece she had managed to hide during the initial processing. It was the last thing she owned that proved she came from a family, from a history, not just from this filth. She pulled it out. The silver caught the dim light. She placed it on the metal grating. The guard stopped chewing. He looked at the watch, then at the bucket. He didn't take the watch immediately. He looked around to ensure no officer was watching. He kicked a second, full canteen across the grate toward her. Take it, he muttered, sweeping the watch into his pocket in one fluid motion. And stay down. Helga descended into the gloom. The water in the canteen sloshed a sound more precious than gold. Back at the bulkhead, she poured a small amount onto a rag torn from her skirt. She dabbed Ingrid's forehead. The cloth came away black. She wiped the girl's neck, trying to cool the blood. It was a futile gesture. The dirt was winning. Helga looked at her own hands, now empty of the watch, covered in the same grime that coated the walls of the ship. They were becoming part of the cargo. Just crates of defeated flesh being shipped across the ocean. "Is it clean?" Ingrid whispered. Eyes closed. "Yes." Helga lied, looking at the black rag. "It is very clean." November 1945, Camp Lee, Virginia. The blinding sunlight of the New World hurt Helga's eyes. After the gloom of the ship's hold, the brightness of Virginia felt like an assault. They had been herded off the train and onto the backs of canvas-covered trucks, driving for hours through a landscape that defied Helga's understanding of war. There were no craters, no skeletal remains of bombed-out cathedrals. The fields were swollen with harvest, the forests were thick and green, and the towns they passed were intact, painted in white and pastel colors. It was a sickening display of abundance. Helga sat near the tailgate, clutching the side rail. Her hands were hideous against the fresh green paint of the American truck. The layer of grime on her skin had evolved. It was no longer just dirt, but a hardened carapace of sweat, dead skin, and ship oil. She smelled herself, a sharp, fermented odor that filled the truck bed, and she saw the American driver wrinkle his nose through the rear window. The truck slowed, turning off the paved road onto a gravel track. Red dust billowed up behind them, coating their uniforms in a fine, rust-colored powder. It was different from the gray brick dust of the Ruhr. It tasted of clay and raw earth. "Camp," Ingrid whispered, pointing through the gap in the canvas. Camp Lee spread out before them, a sprawling grid of low wooden barracks and tents. It did not look like the prison camps Helga had heard of in the East. There were fences, yes, and watchtowers, but the atmosphere was bustling. The truck ground to a halt near a sector separated by wire mesh. "Rouse! Everybody out!" the guard shouted. Helga climbed down, her legs stiff. As her boots hit the red gravel, she felt the gaze of the camp upon them. American soldiers stopped their work to look. They were giants. These men fed on milk and beef, their uniforms crisp, their faces shaven. They looked at the women not with lust, but with a mixture of curiosity and repulsion. Helga straightened her spine. Let them look. Let them see what their bombers had done. "Line up. Face front." While the guards counted them, Helga's eyes darted around the perimeter, assessing threats. To her right, a squad of engineers was working on a new structure. It was made of raw yellow pine, standing out against the weathered gray of the older barracks. She narrowed her eyes. It was a long, narrow building with a high roof. Men were carrying galvanized pipes into the entrance. Another man was on the roof, installing a metal chimney. "Gas?" Clara murmured beside her, her voice barely audible. "No," Helga said quickly, though her own heart skipped a beat. "Too much ventilation. But look at the pipes. Water." "A hosing station," Clara said, trembling. "Like the cattle." Helga watched a soldier hammer a nail into a door frame. Bang, bang, bang. The rhythm was steady, unhurried. It didn't sound like the frantic construction of a killing ground, but the efficiency was terrifying in its own way. If they planned to strip them and spray them down in the freezing November air, they were building a very elaborate stage for it. The soldier on the roof finished with the chimney and wiped his hands on a clean rag. He tossed the rag down. It landed near Helga's feet. It was white, spotted with grease, but still cleaner than the shirt on her back. "Move it out! Barracks 4, the guard ordered. Helga stepped over the rag. She looked at the chimney one last time. Smoke began to curl from it, thin and gray. They were heating something. As she marched her women toward the holding huts, she tightened her muscles, preparing for the humiliation she was certain would come with the morning sun. The barracks assigned to the women was a simple structure of pine and tar paper, smelling intensely of resin and the accumulated stench of 24 unwashed bodies. Night had fallen over Virginia, bringing with it a silence that felt heavier than the artillery barrages of the Ruhr. Outside, the crickets created a rhythmic, alien pulse. Inside, the air was thick with the rustle of straw mattresses and the scratching of fingernails against skin. Helga sat on the edge of her bunk, her back rigid. She could not sleep. To lie down was to surrender to the lice that infested the seams of her gray uniform. The fabric had become stiff, coated in a mixture of grease, coal dust from the transport trains, and the salt spray of the Atlantic crossing. It was no longer clothing. It was a husk, a second skin that protected them from the world but imprisoned them in their own filth. "Did you see the chimney?" Clara whispered from the bunk above. Her voice was thin, threading through the darkness. The building they were working on. It had a chimney. "It is a boiler, Clara," Helga said, keeping her voice steady, though her own heart hammered a warning rhythm against her ribs. "For heating water. Or for gas," another voice chimed in from the corner. "They say the Americans are gangsters. They say they have camps too. Retribution. Eye for an eye." "Stop it," Helga commanded. She stood up, her boots scuffing the wooden floor. The movement released a fresh wave of stale odor from her tunic. She felt a profound sense of shame, not for the defeat, but for this, the animalistic reduction of their humanity. For 6 months, they had not felt warm water. They had learned to scrape mud from their skin with dry sticks and to use sand to scour their hands. They were women of civilization, reduced to scratching like strays. Helga walked to the window. Through the mesh screen, she could see the silhouette of the new building under the moonlight. It stood apart from the other structures, silent and ominous. The wooden latch the soldier had hammered earlier was just a small shadow against the pale wood. Was it a latch to keep the world out, or to lock them in? The propaganda had been relentless. "The Americans are mongrels," the radio had said. "They lack discipline. They will strip you and film you for their newsreels." Helga touched her collar, pulling it tighter. If they were to be marched out naked into the cold morning air, if they were to be hosed down like cattle in front of the jeering GIs, she would stand in front of Ingrid. She would take the first blast of the water. The door to the barracks swung open abruptly, letting in a rectangle of sharp, artificial light from the guard tower. The chatter ceased instantly. Sergeant Miller stood in the doorway. He looked different, without the soft twilight of the previous day. In the harsh beam of his flashlight, he was simply a towering figure in a victor's uniform. He held a clipboard, his expression unreadable. "Get them up," Miller said to Helga, recognizing her rank by the way she stood. "Formation, outside in 5 minutes. Bring nothing. You leave the clothes here." "Leave the clothes?" Helga repeated, her English clumsy. "Burn pile," Miller said, gesturing vaguely behind him. "Hygiene protocol. We're scrubbing you down." A gasp rippled through the room. It was happening. The stripping. The public exposure. Helga felt the blood drain from her face, but she nodded once. A sharp, mechanical jerk of the chin. She turned to the women, her eyes hard. "Stand up," she ordered in German. "Dignity. Do not let them see you shiver." The walk from the barracks to the new structure was less than 200 yards. But to Helga, it felt like a march across a frozen continent. The morning air in Virginia was deceptive. The sun was bright, yet the wind carried a biting chill that cut through their threadbare uniforms. "Keep your eyes forward," Helga hissed under her breath to the line of women behind her. Do not look at them. Do not give them the satisfaction. But it was impossible not to feel the weight of the camp. As they crunched over the gravel, activity in the surrounding sector seemed to slow. American soldiers paused in their morning routines. A mechanic lowered a wrench. A cook stepped out of a mess tent, wiping his hands on an apron. Helga braced herself for the whistles, the catcalls, the jeers that usually accompanied the movement of female prisoners in occupied territories. She stiffened her spine, creating a shield of cold indifference, preparing to become a spectacle. Surprisingly, The camp remained mostly quiet. There was no raucous laughter, only the low murmur of conversation and the clatter of mess kits. The soldiers watched them with a curiosity that felt detached, almost clinical. It was unnerving. Helga would have preferred hatred. Hatred she understood. This strange, quiet observation made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. A biological problem to be solved, rather than an enemy to be punished. Ingrid stumbled on a loose stone, gasping as she nearly fell. Helga caught her arm instantly, her grip bruising through the wool sleeve. "Steady," Helga whispered, pulling the girl upright. "We are almost there." "I can't do it, Oberon," Ingrid whimpered, her teeth chattering. "I can't let them see me." "You will do it because you must," Helga said, though her own stomach twisted with bile. They approached the wooden building. Up close, the structure was imposing. It was built of raw, yellow pine that hadn't yet weathered to gray. Above the roofline, the metal pipe she had seen yesterday was now belching a steady, thick plume of white smoke into the blue sky. Helga's breath caught in her throat, a jagged lump of panic. Smoke. In her mind, smoke meant only one thing. She stopped abruptly, causing the line of women to accordion behind her. "Move along," a voice said. It was Sergeant Miller. He was standing by the double doors of the building, not blocking them, but ushering them in. Beside him stood two other GIs. They were not holding rifles. They were not holding high-pressure hoses meant to strip skin and dignity alike. They were holding boxes. Helga forced her legs to move. She stepped onto the wooden ramp leading to the entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She expected to walk into a large, open bay, a concrete floor where they would be herded together, stripped and sprayed with freezing water while men watched from the gallery. That was the efficiency of war. That was how mass hygiene was conducted. Instead, as she crossed the threshold, she was hit by a wall of sensation that stopped her dead. Heat. Not the dry, suffocating heat of a burning building, but a wet, heavy, embracing warmth. The air inside was thick with steam, swirling in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the high windows. And the smell, it wasn't the chemical sting of disinfectant or the metallic tang of fear. It was the resinous, sharp scent of fresh pine sap and something else, something sweet and fatty. Through the mist, Helga saw that the large room was not an open pit. A central corridor ran down the length of the building, and on either side there were doors. Rows of wooden doors, partitions, individual stalls, Miller said, his voice echoing slightly in the humid air. He tapped the clipboard. "One woman, one stall. You go in, you lock it. You don't come out until you're clean." Helga stared at him, the translation processing slowly in her fatigue-addled brain. "Lock it?" She looked at the nearest door. There, mounted on the inside frame, was a simple, wooden swivel latch. A device so primitive, yet in this moment, it represented a luxury she hadn't possessed since the bombing of Dresden. Privacy. End quote. Helga did not move immediately. The steam swirled around her boots, rising from the gaps in the floorboards, carrying with it that disarming scent of pine. Sergeant Miller stepped back, giving them space. It was a tactical retreat, she realized. He was removing his imposing height from the equation to let the architecture speak for itself. "Go," she whispered to the women behind her, though no one moved. They were waiting for her. The leader had to test the ice before the pack could cross. Helga stepped toward the first door on the left. It was simple construction, rough-sawn timber that still held the golden hue of new wood. She ran her hand along the frame, feeling for wires, for hidden mechanisms. She checked the ceiling, no vents, no glass observation panels, just the rafters and the tin roof drumming softly with the vibration of the boiler. She stepped inside the stall. It was small, barely 4 feet wide, But to a woman who had spent 6 months sleeping shoulder to shoulder in trucks and cargo holds, it felt like a cathedral. A wooden bench, a single hook on the wall, and there, piping, running down to a faucet. But her eyes fixated on the door. In every cell she had ever inhabited, the lock was iron, heavy, and mounted on the exterior. The control belonged to the captor. Here, the device was a simple block of wood on a pivot, screwed into the frame inside the stall. She pushed the door shut. It swung smoothly on well-oiled hinges, cutting off the view of the sergeant and the anxious faces of her comrades. She was alone. Helga lifted her hand, her fingers trembling slightly not from cold, but from the magnitude of the action. She placed her thumb against the wooden block and rotated it. Thunk. The sound was dull and solid. She pushed against the door with her shoulder. It held. For a moment, Helga just stood there, her forehead resting against the rough grain of the pine door. The silence in the small cubicle was absolute, save for the hiss of the pipes. No guards. No orders. No eyes. The latch was a physical manifestation of a concept she thought she had lost. Agency. By giving her the lock, the Americans had handed her a weapon, not to fight them, but to reclaim herself. She took a breath, deeper than any she had taken since the Ruhr. The air was hot and clean. "It is safe," she shouted through the wood, her voice cracking slightly. "Lock the doors. Use the latch." Outside, she heard the shuffling of boots, the creak of hinges, and then a cascade of sounds down the line. Thunk, thunk, thunk. One by one, the women of the Wehrmacht sealed themselves away. The tension that had held them upright, like a corset for half a year, suddenly snapped. Helga turned away from the door and looked at the bench. Sitting there, wrapped in white paper, was a rectangular block. Next to it lay a folded white towel, thick and soft. She reached out and picked up the block. The paper wrapper was crisp. She tore the corner. Inside, the bar was a creamy white, stamped with a single word: Ivory. It seemed impossible that something so perfect could exist in the same world as the mud of the transit camps. She began to unbutton her tunic. The gray wool, stiff with grime, fell to the floor. Then the shirt. Then the undergarments that had turned the color of ash. She stood naked in the steam, shivering as the armor of her uniform was finally stripped away, leaving only the woman and the dirt she carried. Helga reached for the faucet handle. It was warm to the touch, vibrating slightly with the pressure contained behind it. She twisted the metal cross. The pipes groaned, a low, mechanical shudder that sounded like a beast waking from a long hibernation, followed by a burst of steam, and then the water itself. It came out in a torrent, hot and clear. She stepped under the stream. The shock was immediate. Her body, accustomed to the dull ache of cold dampness, recoiled instinctively before surrendering. The heat hammered against her shoulders, stinging the raw patches of skin where her uniform had rubbed for weeks. It hurt, but it was a magnificent, cleansing pain. She leaned her head back, letting the water plaster her matted hair against her skull, closing her eyes as the first layer of the Ruhr pocket began to dissolve. Looking down, she watched the water swirling around her feet. It was no longer clear. It ran black, a dark, silty river of soot, grease, and dried mud spiraling toward the drain. It looked like ink. She was shedding the war, ounce by ounce. Helga reached for the bar of soap on the bench. Her wet fingers slipped on the smooth surface. Ivory. She had heard of this American soap. They claimed it was so pure it floated. She brought it to her nose. The scent was overwhelming, sharp, soapy, and aggressively clean. It didn't smell like lavender or roses. The scents of her grandmother's house in Dresden. It smelled of industry and efficiency. It smelled like the country that had built this bathhouse in the middle of a forest. She began to scrub. She started with her arms, driving the bar hard against her skin until a thick, white lather bloomed. The friction turned her skin pink, then red. She scrubbed the ingrained dirt from her knuckles, the grime from her neck. The lather turned gray instantly, dying as it fought the filth. She rinsed and lathered again, and again. For the first time in months, Helga touched her own body not to check for lice or injuries, but to care for it. The sensation broke something inside her. Under the roar of the falling water, a sob tore from her throat. It was a jagged, ugly sound, but the steam swallowed it. She cried for the lost uniform. She cried for the dignity she thought she had forfeited in the cattle cars. She cried because the soap was soft and the water was hot, and she hadn't realized how much she had missed the simple feeling of being human. Safe behind the locked pine door, she allowed herself 5 minutes of weakness. She let the tears mix with the shower water, indistinguishable and equally salty. Eventually, the water running off her body turned clear. The black river at her feet faded to a pale gray, then to transparency. Helga turned off the faucet. The sudden silence in the small stall was heavy, filled only by the sound of her own dripping hair. She reached for the towel. It was thick, white cotton, smelling of bleach and sunshine. As she dried herself, the roughness of the fabric felt grounding. She was pink, scrubbed raw, and shivering slightly. Not from cold, but from the exposure of new skin to the air. On the bench, the Americans had left a bundle. Not her old gray tunic that was gone, likely burning in a pit outside by now. Instead, there was a set of clean undergarments and a plain denim work dress. It was utilitarian, devoid of rank or insignia. Helga pulled the dress over her head. It was loose, meant to fit anyone, but the fabric was clean. She buttoned the front, her fingers clean and pale against the blue cloth. She picked up the bar of Ivory soap, now worn down at the edges, and wrapped it carefully back in its paper. She would keep it. It was no longer just soap. It was proof. She unlocked the latch. Click. She pushed the door open, stepping out of the steam and back into the world, leaving the war in the drain behind her. The door to stall number 1 opened, and Helga Müller stepped out into the central corridor. The mist in the room had thickened, softening the sharp edges of the wooden beams. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the hush of a library or a church after a service. Helga smoothed the front of the blue denim work dress. It was 2 sizes too big, ballooning around her waist, but the fabric was dry and smelled of starch. It felt strange against her skin, light, airy, lacking the heavy, damp friction of her old uniform. She felt exposed, not because she was naked, but because she was clean. The layer of gray armor she had worn for half a year was gone, revealing the pale, tired woman beneath. Down the line, other doors opened. Ingrid emerged from stall 3, her face flushed pink from the heat, her wet hair plastered to her skull. She looked younger, almost like a schoolgirl, the hardness around her eyes softened by the simple act of washing. They looked at each other, unrecognizable, without the grime. A ghost of a smile touched Ingrid's lips, fleeting but real. "Gather up," Helga said, her voice softer than usual. The harsh command tone of the Oberon felt out of place in this warm, pine-scented sanctuary. They walked toward the exit. The wooden floorboards were wet with their footprints clean. Wet footprints, not muddy tracks. At the door, Sergeant Miller was waiting. Helga braced herself again. Now that they were clean, now that they looked like women again instead of refugees, would the professionalism vanish? Would the wolf appear? She stepped into the sunlight, blinking against the glare. The cold air hit her wet hair, a sharp reminder that winter was coming. But the core of heat from the bathhouse remained in her bones. Miller did not leer. He did not scan their bodies. He looked at the clipboard, made a check mark, and then reached into a crate beside him. "Rations," he said, holding out another bar of Ivory soap, still in its wrapper, and a small tin of tooth powder. "Weekly issue. Don't lose it." Helga took the items. Her hands, scrubbed pink and raw, trembled slightly as she accepted the gift. It wasn't just supplies. It was a bizarre, unexpected trust. In the camps she had feared, prisoners were kept filthy to break their spirits. Here, the enemy was handing them the tools to maintain their humanity. "Thank you," Helga said. The English words felt clumsy in her mouth, rusty from disuse and prejudice. Miller looked at her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief second. There was no hatred in them, only a weary sort of duty. "The mess hall is next. Hot chow at 1,700. Beef stew. Mess. Beef. Beef." He turned away to check the next group. Helga walked down the ramp, clutching the soap and powder to her chest. The camp looked different now. The barbed wire was still there. The guards were still armed. But the monster she had built in her mind began to dissolve. She looked back at the bathhouse, the chimney puffing white smoke into the blue sky. It was just a building with hot water and locks on the inside. "Come," she said to Ingrid, clutching the girl's shoulder. "We must dry our hair before the food comes." As they walked back to the barracks, Helga realized she was no longer marching. She was strolling. The crushing weight of the war hadn't disappeared. But for the first time in 6 months, she felt strong enough to carry it. By evening, the barracks had transformed. The sharp, acrid stench of unwashed bodies, sour wool, and fear that had permeated the wood for days was gone. It was replaced by the sterile, slightly chemical, yet undeniably pleasant scent of 24 bars of Ivory soap. The air felt lighter, as if the humidity of the bathhouse had followed them home to scrub the atmosphere clean. Helga sat on her bunk, smoothing the coarse wool of the gray blanket. She took the fresh bar of soap Sergeant Miller had given her and placed it on the small wooden shelf above her pillow. Against the rough, unfinished pine, the white rectangle looked like a piece of polished marble, an artifact from a cleaner, more civilized world. It was no longer just a hygiene product. It was an anchor. "It makes us weak," a voice cut through the quiet hum of the room. Helga turned slowly. It was Clara. The woman was clean, her hair damp and combed back, her skin scrubbed pink, but her eyes remained hard, burning with the embers of the old regime. Clara was wearing the same blue denim work dress as everyone else, but she tugged at the collar as if it were a noose. "We are soldiers," Clara hissed, stepping closer to Helga's bunk so only the immediate circle could hear. "Accepting their charity? Washing with their soap? It is the first step to collaboration. Next, you will be smiling at the guards. Then, you will be telling them where our units are hiding." The low chatter in the barracks died down. The women looked from Clara to Helga. The divide was clear. The ideological purity of the past versus the pragmatic survival of the present. The tension threatened to shatter the fragile peace they had just found. Helga stood up. Even in the ill-fitting dress, she held the posture of the Oberon. She did not raise her voice. "Look at your hands, Clara," Helga said quietly. Clara blinked, surprised by the request, but she didn't move. "Look at them," Helga repeated, sharper this time. "Yesterday, they were black with filth. You scratched your skin until it bled. You smelled of the cattle car. Did that make you a better soldier for Germany? Or did it just make you an animal?" Clara flushed, hiding her clean hands in the folds of her dress. "Discipline is about resistance. Discipline is order." Helga interrupted, her voice steel. "Discipline is hygiene. A soldier who rots in her own filth is useless to her country and dangerous to her comrades. Typhus does not care about your politics." She reached out and touched the bar of soap on her shelf. A deliberate, reverent gesture. "This is not charity. This is the Geneva Convention. And more importantly, it is dignity. If they treat us like humans, we must act like humans. Not for them, for ourselves. She picked up the soap and held it out, not to Clara, but towards the room, displaying it like a medal. From now on, this barracks will be inspected every morning. Bedding tight, floors swept, personal hygiene maintained. We will not be the dirty prisoners they expect. We will be German women. Clara stared at her, her jaw working, but the fire in her eyes dimmed. She looked around the room. The other women were nodding. They were touching their own bars of soap, running fingers over clean hair, checking their reflections in the darkened windows. The physical sensation of cleanliness was a powerful narcotic. It felt too good to reject for the sake of an abstract war that was already lost. Fine, Clara muttered, retreating to her own bunk. But she did not throw her soap away. She placed it carefully under her pillow, hoarding the scent. Helga sat back down. Her heart was beating fast, but her hands were steady. She looked out the window. The sun was setting over the Virginia pines, casting long purple shadows across the camp. In the distance, she heard the faint sound of a radio playing from the American guard post, a slow, jazzy tune that would have been forbidden back home. She didn't hate it. She lay back, her head near the shelf. The scent of the soap drifted down to her. A clean, white smell that blocked out the memories of the mud. For the first time in 6 months, Helga Müller did not dream of the trenches. She dreamed of a white room with a lock on the inside. The 24th of December, 1945. Camp Lee, Virginia. Snow had been falling since dawn, coating the red Virginia clay in a blanket of silence. Inside the barracks, the stove glowed cherry red, fed by the extra wood rations Sergeant Miller had authorized earlier that morning. It was warm, and for the first time in years, the warmth felt permanent. Helga sat at the small table near the window, a piece of lined paper before her. The barracks was busy with a quiet, industrious energy. Ingrid and Clara were cutting shapes out of tin cans to hang on a small pine bough they had dragged in from the woods. The mess hall cooks had accidentally left a crate of flour and sugar near the fence. And now the smell of simple biscuits baking on the stovetop mingled with the scent of pine resin. It smelled like Christmas. Not a German Christmas, and certainly not an American one, but something new, a holiday born of survival. Helga dipped her pen into the inkwell. The repatriation ships were slow, and the mail was slower. But she needed to write this. She needed to put the last 6 months into words to understand them herself. Dearest Mutti, she wrote, her handwriting small and precise. I hope this letter finds you, and that the roof of the house has held through the winter. Do not worry about me. I am safe. I am clean. She paused, looking at the ink glistening on the page. How could she explain this place to a woman living in the rubble of Dresden? You would not believe the Americans, she continued. They are strange conquerors. They do not shout. They do not strike us. When we arrived, covered in the filth of the journey, I expected them to hose us down like livestock. I was ready to hate them. I was ready to die hating them. Helga looked up. Outside the window, through the falling snow, she could see the bathhouse. Smoke puffed gently from its chimney. It stood as a monument in the center of the camp, not a monument to victory, but to decency. Instead, she wrote, they built us a house for washing. They gave us doors that lock from the inside. They gave us hot water and white soap that floats. It sounds like a small thing. Mutti, I know. But when I slid that wooden latch shut for the first time, I realized the war was truly over. They did not just wash away the dirt, they washed away the fear. They gave me back my name, too. The door to the barracks opened, letting in a gust of snowy wind. Sergeant Miller stepped in. He stomped the snow off his boots, holding a small box. Mail call is done, he said, his voice gruff but lacking any real edge. "But the chaplain sent these over. Said you might want them for tonight." He set the box on the table. It was full of candles. Real beeswax candles. Helga stood up. She looked at the American, then at the candles. "Thank you, Sergeant." "Merry Christmas, ma'am," Miller said. He touched the brim of his cap a salute, not to an officer, but to a person, and turned back into the snow. Helga picked up a candle. She lit it from the stove and placed it on the windowsill, next to her bar of Ivory soap. The flame reflected in the glass, illuminating her face. She looked tired, yes, and older than her 28 years. But the hardness was gone. Her eyes were clear. She sat back down and finished her letter. "We are prisoners, yes, but tonight we are warm. And tomorrow we will be clean again. I think we will be all right." She laid the pen down. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the fences, the wire, and the red dust, turning the whole world into a clean, white page, waiting to be written upon.